Hello? Now, yeah. Hi, everyone. How are you doing? Such an honor to be here. I'm enjoying the conference so much. Yeah, my name is Dani Devesa, and today we're going to speak a bit about accessibility. So I like to think that we developers are some sort of superheroes with a double life. Like during the nights and weekends, spare time, we like to work in our own project, contribute to open source projects, share our knowledge in conferences like this one or meetups. But even Superman needed a real job to pay the bills, right? And he worked for the Daily Planet, and I joined Skyscanner just 6 months ago, more or less. And I have to say that our app at the moment is not a very good example in terms of accessibility. But the good thing is that ever since I joined, I keep meeting more and more people in the company that acknowledges that we have a problem and that we need to improve a lot. But what I really like is the attitude that they have. So they don't want just to check some boxes and say, here it is, it's now accessible, and that's it. They want to create a great experience for users that need any assistive technologies, just as we do with any other of our users. So I like this idea of not just being average, but go like that extra mile, one step further, and be great in something. So if you don't know where the name of the talk comes from, it's from a movie called This is the Spinal Tap, and it's a mockumentary from the 80s, and it's about a rock band. And at one point, the director of the movie is interviewing one of the guitarists of the band, and the guitarist is probably showing one of the amplifiers and how all the numbers go up to 11. And the director says, like, but is it any louder? And he says, like, of course, it's one louder. And I like this attitude of, yeah, like, let's go, let's do more, let's be the best we can do. So I'm going to show you some things we've done, some things we're doing, and some things we are planning to do. But to get to 11, we have to start from 0. So we have the accessibility dial in the top right corner, and we'll start with some of the basics, and we'll go like keep tuning it all the way up to 11. So let's imagine we are developing an app for the latest iPhone model in the market, and it's an app for tracking our favorite conferences. So we'll start talking about VoiceOver. VoiceOver is the screen reader that comes in iOS, and it helps the blind users and low vision users to navigate the phone. Basically, there are two main ways of navigating the app. You can just move your finger around the screen, and VoiceOver will speak out loud what is being selected. Or you can swipe right and left to go to the next and previous element. And same thing, VoiceOver will read what is selected. So in this case, for example, if we select the text field, it will say something like conference name, mobile conf, text field, double tap to edit. And that's not just a huge blob of text, that's actually 4 properties. The label is conference name, is what that element is. Then mobile conf is what is called the value. In this case, it's the text that is being introduced in the text field. Then text field itself, that's called the trait, and it tells the user how to interact with that element. And double tap to edit is what is called a hint. So a hint is something that tries to explain the user like a bit more how to interact with a component if it's not clear. And the good thing is it is read at the end of it and after a pause. So if the user is experienced and they know already how to use it, they can just swipe right and go to the next element. So don't be afraid of adding hints to your components if you feel that they need further explanation. In this case, for example, if we swipe left, by default, it would go the focus to the conference name label. But ideally, we want to avoid that because the text field already had a label that is conference name, and it would be a duplication of information. So we'll see now how to do that. If we swipe left, it would go to the done button, and we'll say done button. That's the label and the trait. And if we swipe left one more time, it would say conference heading. By the way, most of the examples are about voiceover, but as we'll see, if you improve your voiceover experience, it will help other assistive technologies to work better as well. So imagine that we get the latest Mac as well, we install the latest version of Xcode, and the code looks something like this. So there's a first property, it's called is accessibility element, and that's just that, like, is that element going to be able to be reached using voiceover or not? So it is very tempting to say that everything should be accessible, but as we've seen in the previous example, there was one label that we probably want to skip. So in that case, we will set that property to false. And sometimes, for example, you may have images that are purely decorative and they don't provide any extra information to the user. In that case, we can just set them to false as well. Accessibility label is a string that we provide, and it is a good idea to set a localized string, because that way, if we translate our app in different languages, it will still work for voiceover users from different countries. Then we have the accessibility traits. We've seen a few examples like the button, the header, or the text field. You can combine more than one with the pipe operator, the vertical line, and it is combined with the trace of the super view as well, super view. And another good thing to know as well is that they're localized for you, so you don't have to provide any translations for that. The next one is the value. We've seen also the text field example, where the value is the text that you're typing, but another example could be a slider where you can select a value. And the last one, it's probably the one that you don't have to use many times, is called accessibility frame, and it specifies where the frame from VoiceOver, when you select an item, is displayed. But most of the times, that one will just work for you. And let's talk a bit more about labels, because good accessibility labels are the foundation of any good accessible app. And it is very important to test it in the device, because sometimes you may assume things work in one way, and then when you try it, it's not quite what you expected. And even if the user may be able to understand what is going on, it may not be quite right. So these are all examples of previous apps I've worked in the past. And it is super easy to forget to give proper accessibility labels when you're using things like units or dates or abbreviations as well. So for example, if you have 4D, VoiceOver would just say 4D, which is not like very helpful. And 4 days ago would be probably a better approach. Then you may have 3H24M. VoiceOver somehow it says 3H24 meters, but what we really want to say here is 3 hours and 24 minutes. Or something like Mon, if you say Monday instead of Mon, it's much clearer as well. And at least in English, sometimes like you have words that are written the same way, but pronounced differently depending on the context, like this example here. And I used to do this trick of changing the accessibility label a little bit for VoiceOver to say what I wanted for it to say. But I learned that that's probably not a good idea, because if a user is using Braille keyboards, Braille screens to read the screen, it may mess up with the output of those devices. But we'll see in the next slide how we can fix that. So in VoiceOver, the same way you can set accessibility labels, you can set accessibility attributed labels, just like with strings as well. One of those attributes is the speech language. This is super useful because this emoji here in the right is the emoji of the paella. Paella is a rice dish very typical from the region of Valencia, where I'm from. And if you have that word in an app and VoiceOver is in English, it will say something like pila. Obviously, I get very annoyed when I hear that, but it's super easy to fix. So when setting the accessibility label, instead, just you can set an accessibility attributed label with the speech language set to Spanish, and then it will just say, jump to the Spanish VoiceOver version and read that word for you. And it will say paella. The good thing as well is that you can use that for any words in other languages, for example, for names of places as well. If you don't want for VoiceOver to jump to a different voice to read that word, this is another approach as well. You can use the IPA notation. IPA is a nice beer, but it's also the international phonetic alphabet. And basically, it lets you specify these strange characters that show you the phonetic representation of a word to specify to VoiceOver how it needs to read that word. And it sounds a bit robotic, but it kind of works. And then you avoid for VoiceOver to switch to a different voice. And this is the last slide about labels, because we could talk about labels for the whole 30 minutes. But this is very important, because what I've seen in lots of apps is that when you have a button without a title, like VoiceOver doesn't know where to get the accessibility label from, and trying to guess, it tries to get the next thing that would probably make more sense, which is the image file name in this case. So a lot of times you'll see like that you focus a button using VoiceOver, and it just says button, which is not very helpful. Or sometimes it says something like close icon at 3x. It's not closing 3 times faster. So, or you can say something like close _001 _. You get it, like awful. And then another good thing to know is you don't need to specify in the label that is a button, because then it would say close button, and it's duplicate information. So for buttons with just images, the best thing is to just say what the button is going to do. And I want to talk a bit more about one of the traits. It's the heading one. And this is because I think it's a super important one when you are using an app. You use headers to quickly identify the information you're looking for. And it really helps you like go straight to the point and to the information you're trying to look for. And VoiceOver users do exactly the same. And the way they do it is by navigating through headings. So imagine that in this case, for example, you start navigating the app and you want to go to the second group of information. You would need to do like 10 swipes before even knowing what is next. But if you set the accessibility headings properly, you can use the rotor, which is like if you switch with 2 fingers on the screen, like trying to turn off a knob, it will appear this menu here, which has like many options. It's super customizable. And one of them is headings. If you have the mouse selected, you can swipe up and down, and it will just jump to the next heading or the previous one. As I said, it's super customizable. Like you can go to settings, and you can do other things like navigating from one character to the next one, navigating using words. You can change the speech rate, or many other things like that. And the good thing is that the code is super simple, just one line. Like if you have a label or a view that you want to specify as a header or heading, you just need to specify that the accessibility trait is the accessibility traits heading. And I like to call this one the escape room. I'm sure you're experienced a lot that you're using an app and you're trying to close a model view, and you keep trying the button and suddenly it works, but you need it to try 3 times, or you have a popover and you tap outside and it doesn't close for any reason. So that's the experience you may be offering to some of your users that use VoiceOver, because there's this special gesture called escape gesture. It's a Z gesture on the screen with 2 fingers, and that's meant to bring you back to the previous place you were on. So if you're using a navigation controller that works for free, you can try. You do the Z gesture, and it just goes back to the previous one. But if you're using a modal view, it doesn't work by default. I think that's because most modal views may need some confirmation from the user to close it. Like, think about you're writing an email, for example, and before closing it, you may need to save the draft or to delete the draft. So you need to implement it yourself. And the same way, if you're implementing like any custom modals, popovers, action sheets that come from the bottom, or alerts, you'll need to implement this by yourself as well. The good news is super easy to do. So you have to just override this accessibility perform escape function here, and dismiss the view however you want, and then return true if you were able to dismiss the view. And that way, when the user does a register in the screen, when using VoiceOver, they'll be able to just go back where they wanted to go. And this is called notifications. So how VoiceOver works in a simplified way is it asks your app for a list of items, and then your app gives a list of all the items that are on screen with enough information for the VoiceOver to be able to vocalize what is on the screen. But sometimes the screen may change, and most of times the VoiceOver will ask your app for a new list of items, but some others it won't, and you have to post a notification to VoiceOver saying that the screen changed. You see that happening a lot in things like this, where you implement your own custom model as well, or many of the other scenarios we've seen, like if you have a custom alert, custom action sheet, or a popover, things like that. So in those cases, if the screen changed like a lot, like in this case, you want to tell VoiceOver that the screen changed completely. In the other hand, if it changes just a little bit, like think about when you're watching a YouTube video and then you can tap and it unveils some description of the video. In that case, you can tell VoiceOver the layout changed, but not the whole screen. So these are the two possible notifications, screen changed and layout change for those two examples. The other property here at the bottom is accessibility view is modal. And this is important because sometimes you may see that when you do things like what we've seen before, VoiceOver tries to go to the elements on screen from left to right, top to bottom. And if you have a view that's overlaying something underneath, it will jump to the elements like in a way that seems quite random. So it doesn't matter if the view is on top of it, it will just jump from one element to the other. And if you do this, you're telling VoiceOver, this view is modal, ignore any siblings. So it will just read whatever is in that view or a sub-view of that view. And there are a ton of times where an app has a main functionality. When that happens, usually the button is very recognizable, is bigger maybe, it's in a very recognizable place as well. Some examples are play or pause music or video, or it may be taking a photo, or it may be pausing or starting a timer or something like that. And in those cases, VoiceOver users have something called the magic tap. And the magic tap looks like that. It's a double tap with 2 fingers. And the same way that we did with the perform escape example, you can override this function here. And every time that the user using VoiceOver does a double tap, it will call this function here. And then you can do whatever you want. So for example, in this case, if we have a player, we can check if it's playing. And if it's playing, we pause it. And if it's paused, we play it. And then you can return true if you were able to do something with that gesture. This is kind of a power user feature, so maybe a lot of users won't do it, but it's still very nice to implement. And let's talk about announcements, because sometimes, you are performing a long-running task and it finishes, or the user does something that produces an error. And I've seen this pattern a lot where you show a custom notification or something that looks like a toast or some text appears somewhere. But if a VoiceOver user won't know that happened, in those scenarios you can use announcements where you can make VoiceOver to read something but keep the focus where it was before. So you don't move the focus. In this case, for example, if you are trying to log in and there's this user unavailable error, you can just read that out loud, and when it disappears, like it doesn't matter anymore. Oops. And for this example, it's kind of a combination of two things we've seen before. One is, this is also a notification that you send to UI accessibility. In this case, it's called announcement. And what you pass is a string. But one thing you can do is what it does here in the top, which is you create the attribute string with an attribute that lets you queue notifications, because the default behavior of that is if you read 2 announcements, the second one will interrupt the first one. And by doing that, it will just wait to read the first one, and then it will read the second one. Custom actions is one that is super important as well. A lot of apps use or should use. Imagine this app, not inspired in Twitter at all. By the way, Twitter is a very good example of accessibility a lot of times. And for example, if you're using VoiceOver, you don't want to go from like the user flick right, then the text flick right, then share, then like, then share, then the user again. So it's just too much hassle, right? Like you want to flick once and go to the next tweet, and that's it. Because the other thing is, you're repeating, for example, in this case, repost, like, and share many times. And the other thing is, if you are navigating through many tweets, you may lose context of where those actions from the previous tweet or the next tweet, for example. So what you want to do is something that looks like this. You swipe right, it reads the user and the text, the tweet itself. You swipe right, and then you can swipe up or down to select the action that you want to perform. That can be done with the rotor as well, as we've seen before. Oops. And the code, again, is super simple. You'll see that most of these accessibility features are solved in just a very few lines of code. So the views have this accessibility custom actions array that you can customize. And in this case, what I want to do is to pass 2 or 3 accessibility custom actions that have a name and a selector that is going to be called when you select that action. In iOS 13, there's a new API for this that you can use blocks instead of the target selector scheme, and looks much nicer. And this is a very good example, as we said before, that you're trying to improve something for VoiceOver, and actually you're improving it for many other users. In this case, switch control users. So switch control is a mechanism for navigating your app as well. It's an assistive technology where the user controls the app with one button or switch or more than one. But you'll see that people is capable of doing amazing things in their iOS devices with just one button. And how it works, more or less, is it scans the screen, and then you click that button, and then it stops, and it starts scanning again, and you click that button, and eventually you can select that point and do something. So if you have done these custom actions for VoiceOver users, when you select one view, those actions will appear in the switch control menu. And that way you're saving like multiple interactions of the user to be able to trigger what he's trying to do. Another super important feature is dynamic types. So it's the ability of making a font bigger, like you go to a system and you make the font bigger. This is something most of us are going to need, because hopefully we'll live many years, we'll get older, and we'll need a bigger font to be able to use our apps. And the implementation of dynamic types is usually quite straightforward. So you can just set a preferred text style, and then you can say it's a button or a header, and then it will increase the size accordingly. I recommend to set the number of lines to 0, because that way the label can grow to many lines. And you can use custom fonts as well since iOS 11, and that's pretty nice. But the thing is, if you support larger text, but you're not able to accommodate that text in the app, it's pretty useless, right? Like, this is not very usable. And for that, you can use what is called an alternative layout. So you can basically check like this the trait collection of a view. You can check the preferred content size category, And if it's an accessibility category, you can basically load a different cell, for example. A very nice trick as well is if you're using stack views, the only thing you need to do is to change the axis from horizontal to vertical, depending on the preferred content size category that you're using. And you may think it's not important to support such big interfaces, but this is trying to simulate how a low vision user will perceive your app, and especially if my handwritten writing was better. Like the one in the left, you could probably still try to use the app without using VoiceOver. And this is a less known accessibility feature as well. It's called smart inverted colors. I know that dark mode is coming, but probably a lot of developers won't implement it straight away. And imagine this app, for example, if you use inverted colors, it looks something like this. But using inverted colors shouldn't come at a horrible experience with images in this case. And we all know that Steve Jobs' turtleneck was black and not white. So we want for it to look something like this. And the way we can do that is one line of code as well. It's called smart inverted colors, but it's not as smart because you have to tell what to ignore when you enable that feature. So basically, you can get an image view and set the accessibility ignores invert colors to true. And for the last step, test. Like, it's the most important one. You want to test something in the beginning to find what is wrong with your app, and you want to test something in the end to see if it has improved or what work you have left to do. Not many people know that Xcode has a tool called Accessibility Inspector, and when you open it, you can place it next to the simulator, and you can do things like checking what properties, accessibility properties, the different elements have. You could also, in the new version of Xcode, kind of simulate how VoiceOver speaks that out loud with those play controls there. Then there's a mechanism for auditing your app, and it will find things like low contrast ratios between text and background, or if a hitting area of a button is too small, or if there's something that is missing an accessibility label. And there are many other ways of testing your app. One is screen curtain. That's super fun. You triple tap with 3 fingers your screen, and then the screen goes off, but you can still use VoiceOver. And that's the best way of testing your app because it's the more empathetic one with your VoiceOver users. And if you struggle to navigate, knowing how your app is, like that's a bad sign. System overrides is similar to the accessibility inspector, but it's built into the new Xcode. And shortcuts is you can enable VoiceOver like with a shortcut, triple tapping your home button or your side button if you don't have a home button, and that you can set in the settings in iOS. And there's much more, but we just had 30 minutes today, and I wanted to call my talk accessibility up to 11 and not up to 20 or something like that. But I encourage you to have a look to some of these topics because there's so much to do. And I hope you got some ideas of how to improve your accessibility and accessibility in your apps. Most of the times we create convenient experiences for users. It's a convenient way of buying tickets or a convenient way of getting a cab or a convenient way of comparing flights. But what we don't realize is that a lot of times we are facilitating independence to some people. And what is more powerful than that, right? So I don't know, maybe I'm not that wrong, and sometimes developers were real superheroes. Thank you. I don't know if we have any time for questions.
Yeah, we have 5 minutes. Any questions?
Hi, thanks for your talk. On the last section about testing, I wondered if there's any good ways to use UI tests for testing the accessibility.
Yeah, unfortunately, automating accessibility tests is not very easy at the moment. So it's a shame because you have this audit functionality in the accessibility inspector. that it would be super useful if you could integrate with UI test, and then every time the app goes to a different screen, it could run that audit for you, and then in the end, send you a report of these things are broken. But it's not available at the moment. Hopefully, Apple will work on that. But yeah, I don't know any tools for testing accessibility automatically. So at the moment, it's mostly manual work.
Thank you.
Okay, seems like okay. Thanks, Danny, and people be giving a big applause again. Thanks, Danny.
Thank you very much.